Temperatures still remain below average. Hi everyone, this is Matthew Kruse at Comstock Investments. I'm going to start out kind of jumping in on weather. Obviously, we went through a very wet July. This graph kind of gives you a good depiction of where we are in terms of starting out in the month of August. And you can see here we've had pretty heavy moisture. This kind of departure of precipitation in the month of July beyond what the average is. So you kind of see 4 to 6 inches for most of Iowa, 6 inches in central Iowa. They're very wet. You see most of these areas are in the green, especially in west central Illinois. There is one area that is in the drought monitor map. I don't know if you noticed that. It's a pretty small area in southwest Iowa. This kind of confirms this region here didn't get quite as much rain as the rest of Iowa, but it's a relatively small area. We've talked in the past how kind of the north central part of Indiana is run drier, western Michigan. Now, those areas have gotten rain kind of in the later half of July, but it was still quite a bit less than what their historical average has been. Looking out here into the first week of August, you can still see here, at least in the northern part of the Corn Belt, that there's quite a bit of precipitation, 1 to 2, maybe 3 inches in some areas, especially in this part of North Dakota. Kind of the eastern portion of North Dakota is going to get hit quite a bit with up to 3 inches. But as you kind of head east, rainfall dissipates quite a bit. And I know last week, this kind of southeastern portion of Iowa got like 4 inches. So they've pretty much waterlogged there. So this is probably a good thing for the most part, where, it looks like it's drying up for at least to start out the month of August. And I guess I kind of look at that as a good thing, because I know there are large portions of Iowa that have probably gotten above average rain. And I'm more concerned about too much rain at this point, potential damage that's been done. This goes out a little bit longer, gives you the 2-week forecast. You kind of see that it's pretty spotty in a lot of areas, a lot more scattered showers, but a lot of places are getting something, and it kind of picks up here in those drier areas in Indiana, and that northern region should see an inch or more. I know that southwest corner there, Michigan, 1.5 inches, and so I'm sure they'll look forward to getting that here, but probably not going to show up until later next week. This is kind of the short-term weather anomaly for this 2 weeks. You kind of see a little bit above average rainfall for this portion of the western Corn Belt, up here in the northern Corn Belt, this pocket here in Indiana, but below average in this area here. But as I said, I don't really see any concern there, just because it's been so darn wet. And so I think most people are going to welcome kind of a drying out of the crops here, and as long as it doesn't last too long, as long as the heat doesn't pick up. And talk about the heat here in a second, but this is a much longer time frame out through September 2nd. And I think, we have another couple weeks left of that critical growing window for most of the Corn Belt. And beyond that, weather slowly begins to become, less critical. Obviously, it looks like in the kind of the northern tier here, they're going to get well above average, but most of Iowa and the I states are going to be in that 1 to 1.5 inches below average. And again, I don't see any major concern here. I think a lot of people probably welcome less rainfall at this point. I think we have plenty of precipitation and moisture going into the month of August. I think my biggest concern now, my focus is probably on temperatures and what heat levels are going to do. And so this is going to give you kind of a look here what temperatures are going to range from. Let's back up here, starting, this is August 4th. And so kind of as we're moving through the week, heat tries to advance there further north, coming up from the south, kind of through mid to late week. Temperatures still remain below average, kind of topping out that 80 degrees Fahrenheit. And we really got to get closer to the weekend around Saturday, where we see temperatures start getting closer to 90 degrees. Here we are on Friday. Now we're getting a little bit, now we're into Saturday. You can see there's a lot of pockets here that, especially in Illinois, are getting into the low 90s. A lot of areas in central Iowa, 91 there, I can see. So it's for the most of the week, I think conditions are pretty optimal. And I think the market's going to be looking at that heat kind of taking place in this weekend and look at how extreme it gets and how long it actually lasts. This kind of gives you a longer term example of what the weather anomaly will be through the next 10 days. And you kind of see here as we get out, things do get above average here. It's going to take us out here through, let's see, August 19th. You can kind of see here we're running 8 degrees above average for most of Iowa, 10 degrees there in that one spot. I think the biggest area of concern is kind of this central area of Kansas. It's going to get hot. And I think the precipitation is a little bit below average, but they've been pretty wet up to this point, but we'll see how far that gets. But I think, this is one area of concern. We'll have to see how long this heat lasts, but it looks like it's going to get heat up here quite a bit in the second half of August. As we're going to the month of August, we're trading at the contract lows right now. And I think this is the big question that everybody's trying to answer. And we've kind of had it drilled into our heads at this point that we've got this big crop coming. And so everyone's trying to decide here how big it is. And obviously the USDA report that comes out next week is going to take into play farmer surveys and what their expectations are for yield. And so I think most people would tell you, yeah, it's probably going to be bigger than the 181 that the USDA had originally forecast. But, last year at this time, they increased to 183. And, I think if they came with a 183 yield or even a 184 yield, it's quite possible that the market may even rally just because it's been so negative up until this point and, push the market down so hard. I think to kind of continue in this bear market that we've been in, you're probably going to have to see something in the 185 range or even higher. And so just confirming a modest increase in yield doesn't necessarily mean that it's bearish at this point, just because the market's been out ahead of it so much. And so that's just something to kind of keep in mind. We've had access now that StoneX is our new clearing firm, and they've got some good seasonal information, and this kind of gives you a good picture of where the corn seasonal is at for new crop. In the black line here, you can see where we're at right here. I added this arrow. Obviously we're at the bottom of the barrel right now. And so this isn't anything new, typically in this late in the season, not always, but typically we kind of find ourselves here, toward the bottom end of the range. The good news, at least if you look at kind of the 5-year averages, it's usually where we're around this time in August when we bottom. And that is what happened last year, where I think it was kind of the third week in August that seemed like the bulk of the crop was made at that point, and it quit getting bigger, and the market kind of started a kind of a very slow rally, and it went back and retested its lows again in December, but eventually went and climbed back up to $5. And so, too early to tell if hopefully 2025 and 2026 will look like, this red line again, but obviously it should be no surprise that this is kind of where we're at right here. I thought this was also interesting, just kind of giving an example of, where we usually make our lows for the September contract. And over half the time they're in that month of August, and obviously we're in right now, but the majority, if you add month of July and the month of September, then you're at, closer to 80% of the time we make our lows here in this time period. So as a general statement, not a great moment in time to be making sales. We look for things to improve out later in the year based off these seasonals. And so, unless there's a problem with the crop, which it doesn't appear to be, we actively try to avoid making any sales in this period. Switching shifts here to Brazil, they continue to make a lot of harvest in their safrinha corn in Brazil, and they're closing in on 84%. It looks like on August 5th, that's tomorrow, we estimate they'll be about 84% complete overall. Mato Grosso is just about done. They're 95% complete right now, and so they're on the tail end. And we've heard nothing but good yield reports, and expect to hear the same. They keep ratcheting their expectations higher for yield, and we kind of expect to see the same. I think the USDA was at 132, and so we think they could increase that easily by another 5 million metric tons right now. Ironically, as they're wrapping up second crop corn harvest, they're already gearing up to start their first crop of corn planting in parts of Rio Grande do Sul way down in the south. And so there seems like there's always corn growing at least some point in the year, or it's out in the field in Brazil. So, we've had a real good run here for our corn exports here in the United States. And frankly, that's probably what's kept our head above water, although it maybe doesn't seem like it. We've been very competitive, and demand has been very strong, which rightfully so. As corn cheapens up, you find quite a bit more buyers. This is my concern right now, where we're hitting that time of the year where Brazilian corn exports are going to start to hit the market, and I'm starting to see that now. And I think you're going to see that come into play, and it's going to weigh pretty heavily on the corn market as well. And so typically in that first half of the year, the corn exports drop to nothing, where they pretty much exported everything, and they're out of inventory from the previous year. As we head into August, we don't quite have all the numbers inputted yet for the month of July, but it looks like they're going to be off from where they were at last year. And a lot of that's just because I think the harvest was at least a couple weeks late. But you're going to see things really take off now here as we enter in the month of August, I think, and kind of catch up. And so, August, September, October are their primary export months for Brazilian corn. And I think historically it would tell us that we are going to have a hard time competing with the corn because Brazil has to get it out of the country. They don't have any place to store it. They don't have enough domestic demand for it. And so they just try and scuttle that corn out of their country as quickly as possible. And it usually competes quite a bit with U.S. corn. So I think that's going to weigh heavily on markets, and it's going to have, between that and the weather here, it's going to have a lot to digest. That's what I have for you today. Thank you and have a good day.
Futures trading involves risk. The risk of loss in trading futures and/or options is substantial, and each investor and/or trader must consider whether this is a suitable investment. Past performance is not indicative of future results.